The night of the Ashford Horological Gala, the Fairmont Chateau Laurier smelled like old money and fresh flowers. It was the kind of room that made people straighten their backs without being asked. Chandeliers the size of small cars hung from the vaulted ceiling, throwing fractured light across display cases that held timepieces worth more than most people's houses. Security guards stood near the cases with the practiced stillness of men who had learned to look relaxed while being extremely alert. Waitstaff moved through the crowd carrying champagne flutes on silver trays, and the crowd itself, 300 people in black tie, with another 100 on the wait list who hadn't made the cut, moved and murmured in that particular way of people who were very comfortable being seen. Theodore Marsh almost didn't come. He was 41 years old, a watchmaker who ran a repair shop called Marsh & Sons out of a narrow storefront on Bank Street in Ottawa. The Sons part was aspirational. It had been his father's name for the shop, and Theodore had kept it after his father retired, not because he had sons of his own, but because the sign cost $400 and he couldn't justify replacing it. He had a daughter instead. Her name was Poppy, and she was 7 years old. And on the evening of the gala she was at home with her grandmother, almost certainly still awake, despite having been put to bed twice already, probably reading under the covers with a flashlight she was not supposed to have. Theodore had not planned to attend. The invitation had come through the Ottawa Valley Horological Society, of which he was a dues-paying, but rarely attending member, and it had sat on his workbench for 2 weeks under a parts tray before he found it again. By then, the RSVP window had technically closed. He'd called anyway. The woman who answered had sighed with the particular weariness of someone managing a very large event and told him there might be space for one more. He wore his father's suit, which was slightly too wide in the shoulders. He drove himself because parking near the Chateau Laurier cost $30, and he told himself the walk from the Rideau Center was good for him. What brought him in the end was the centerpiece of the evening's auction. The gala program had described it as a Patek Philippe Caliber 89, one of only 4 ever made, rumored to have surfaced recently in a private estate in Gatineau. Theodore had not slept well the 2 nights after reading that description. He had read it so many times the paper had softened at the fold. The Caliber 89 was not simply an expensive watch. It was, when Patek Philippe completed it in 1989, the most complicated mechanical watch ever made. 33 complications. A star chart, a tourbillon, a thermometer, 570 parts. Theodore had never seen one in person. He had read everything ever written about them. He had explained the escapement mechanism to Poppy once while she ate her cereal, and she had listened with the grave, patient attention of a child who understood that her father's enthusiasm for small gears was a permanent feature of her life and had decided to be gracious about it. He was standing near the display case, close enough that his breath was probably fogging the glass, when someone said his name. It was Harold Fenwick, the society treasurer, a retired civil servant in his late 60s who wore a bow tie to every occasion regardless of formality. Harold was the reason Theodore had the invitation at all. He shook Theodore's hand with both of his own, which was Harold's standard greeting, and steered him toward the bar with the quiet competence of a man who had been steering people toward bars at events for decades. "Glad you came," Harold said. "You'll want to see the Caliber 89 in person before the auction. They've had it out of the case for examination, only until 9. Theodore looked at his own watch. 8:47. He thanked Harold and excused himself and moved back through the crowd toward the main display. He was nearly there when the room shifted, not physically but socially, the way rooms do when someone commanding enters them. Conversations paused, heads turned. The murmur reshuffled. Sylvia Ashford was 53 years old and the third-generation CEO of Ashford Fine Timepieces, the company whose name was on the gala, on the display cases, and on the auction catalog, currently in the hands of most people in the room. She was not tall, but she moved like someone who had never waited for anyone to get out of her way. Her hair was silver and worn back. Her watch, a Vacheron Constantin, Theodore identified it from across the room, was the understated kind of expensive that communicated fluency rather than effort. She had built Ashford fine timepieces from a regional retailer into a national institution. She had a profile in Report on Business and a reputation for blunt assessments delivered with perfect courtesy, which was a particular kind of power. She was moving toward the centerpiece display when her path and Theodore's converged near a standing arrangement of white orchids. She glanced at him the way people at certain events glance at people who don't quite fit, not unkindly, but with the brief categorizing efficiency of someone who processes rooms quickly. Theodore nodded. She nodded back. Both of them looked toward the Caliber 89. It was in a velvet-lined case on a raised platform, lit from below by a warm amber light that made it look like something from a museum, which it essentially was. A woman from the auction house stood nearby with white cotton gloves and an expression that communicated that the gloves were not decorative. A small cluster of guests was gathered, murmuring. Theodore edged closer. He was not naturally an edger. He was the type who usually waited his turn and took the longer route around things. But the watch was there, less than 2 meters away, and he had driven 40 minutes and paid $30 to park and worn his dead father's suit, and he was going to see it. He got close enough. The movement was visible through the sapphire caseback, which the auction house had arranged so that the mechanics could be appreciated. Theodore looked at it for a long time. He was not aware of anything else in the room for approximately 90 seconds. Then the woman with the white gloves said quietly that the case examination period was ending. Theodore stepped back. He became aware that Sylvia Ashford was standing beside him, close enough that he could hear her exhale. "You know what you're looking at," she said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," he said. She studied him with a directness that might have been rude from anyone else and seemed from her like a form of respect. "You're a watchmaker. I have a shop on Bank Street." Something moved across her expression, recognition, maybe, or recalibration. "I've heard of Marsh & Sons. My father took his Omega there years ago, before my time. That would have been my father." A brief pause. Then something almost like warmth. "Your father was very good." He was. The auction house representative was beginning to close the case. The crowd was redistributing toward the dinner tables. Sylvia Ashford didn't move immediately, and neither did Theodore, and in the particular stillness of the room emptying around them, she said, "The Caliber 89 hasn't been serviced in at least 15 years. You can see the amplitude loss in the tourbillon. Whoever had it in Gatineau kept it wound but never had it properly cleaned." Theodore had seen exactly the same thing. "The rate is probably off by 4 or 5 seconds a day," he said. "Maybe more. The mainspring tension is uneven." She looked at him directly again. "Could you correct it, the calibration?" "Yes." The full service would take a week, maybe more, but the timing could be adjusted tonight. She was quiet for a moment. The room had nearly emptied toward the dinner section now. Someone far away was trying to get a microphone to cooperate. "The auction is in 2 hours, she said. "Whoever buys it will want to know what they're actually getting. An accurate rate assessment would affect the bidding." "I know." What happened next? Theodore would think about for a long time afterward. He was not certain whether she planned what she said, or whether it emerged from some combination of the wine and the watch and the strange suspended quality of rooms before dinner begins. But she set her champagne glass down on a nearby table, and she looked at him and she said, "If you can give me an accurate rate reading, properly, on the movement not estimated through the glass, I'll make sure Ashford covers your table for the evening. And dinner. And I'll take you for coffee after." The last part landed differently than the first part. Theodore was not sure what his face did. He hoped it was neutral. "You're the event chair," he said. "You can authorize access to the lot before auction?" "I'm the event chair and the presenting sponsor and my company owns the case it's sitting in," she said. "Yes." Around them, the last few guests were drifting toward the dining hall. A waiter collected the abandoned champagne glass. The orchids stood in their arrangement, white and indifferent. Theodore thought about Poppy. Not strategically. He didn't think about her as a reason or a defense. He just thought about her, the way she had looked that morning, standing in the kitchen in her socks, eating toast, asking him what a gala was, and whether he would bring her back a fancy cracker. "I'll need my kit," he said. "It's in my car." He had almost not brought it. It was habit, the small leather roll of tools he kept in the glove box, the way some people keep jumper cables. He had grabbed it out of reflex on his way out the door that evening. And Poppy's grandmother had looked at it with the expression of someone who had long ago made peace with the fact that her son-in-law traveled with watchmaking tools. Sylvia Ashford looked at him for one more moment. Something in her expression was testing something, though he couldn't have said what. Then she said, "I'll get the curator." The next 20 minutes were quiet and procedural in the way that the most concentrated work always is. Theodore sat at a small table in an anteroom off the main display floor, while the auction house curator and one of Ashford's senior staff watched with the particular energy of people trying not to hover. Caliber 89 was in front of him, removed from its display mount, with the kind of careful choreography that watches worth millions receive as a matter of course. He did not perform competence. He simply was competent, which is a different thing, and visible to anyone paying attention. The tools were what they were, small, specific, worn from years of use and familiar enough in his hands that he stopped thinking about them within the first 30 seconds. He worked by touch and sight, and the accumulated knowledge of 20 years of handling movements, of learning his father's techniques first, by watching, and then by doing, and then, slowly, by improving on them. He could read a movement, the way some people read faces, quickly, with attention to detail, with an understanding that everything visible communicated something if you knew the language. The Caliber 89 was extraordinary in every way a watch could be extraordinary. It was also exactly as Theodore had assessed through the case. Overwound in one mainspring, the tourbillon running slightly fast to compensate. The oil in two of the keyless works dried to a faint residue that had been causing the inconsistent amplitude. He noted everything. He made the adjustments available to him without a full disassembly. He set the watch going and timed it for 8 minutes, with the chronograph on his own watch, which was a Seiko he had rebuilt himself 11 years ago, and which had never lost a second. The rate was 3.8 seconds fast per day, well within what a full service would correct. He wrote his findings on the notepad the curator provided, in the compressed technical notation he used in his shop, and then realized he should probably translate them and wrote a plain English summary below. The curator read both and looked up. "This is exactly what the prospective buyers have been asking about," she said. Sylvia Ashford appeared in the doorway. She had been somewhere else. He'd heard her voice briefly, managing something about seating arrangements, and she came to the table and looked at the watch, and then at the notepad, and then at Theodore. "Clean margins," she said, which he understood to mean she was impressed and was not going to say so directly. "The movement needs a full service before it's worn," he said. "But it's original, unmolested, and it'll keep excellent time once it's properly cleaned." The curator was already on her phone, presumably communicating the rate assessment to people who needed to know it before the bidding began. The Caliber 89 was returned to its case. Theodore rolled his tools back into their leather wrap. The anteroom was quiet. Sylvia Ashford was still there. She had dismissed both the curator and the staff member with small gestures, and the confident economy of someone who did not need to explain why she wanted the room. "You drove from Bank Street?" she said. "Yes." "You almost didn't come," she said. It wasn't a question, and he wasn't sure how she knew. "The RSVP window had passed," he said. She smiled briefly for the first time all evening. It changed her face in a way that was unexpected, and which he filed away without examining too closely. "The coffee offer stands," she said. "Tonight, if you'd like, after the auction. There's a place on Spark Street that's still open late." He thought about Poppy again. He thought about the grandmother who would ask him in the morning how the event was, in the careful way she had of asking questions that were really other questions. "My daughter is at home," he said. "I should get back before it gets too late." Sylvia Ashford absorbed this without any visible change of expression. "How old?" 7. A pause. "What's her name?" "Poppy." Something crossed her face that he could not quite read. Something that was not quite sentimentality and not quite recognition, but was something in that vicinity. "Another time then," she said. "The coffee." He nodded. She moved toward the door and then stopped, and without turning fully back to him, she said, The assessment you did tonight, the rate calculation, the amplitude notes, it's going into the auction catalog as an expert evaluation. I'd like to credit it properly. Marsh & Sons, Bank Street, Ottawa. He said nothing for a moment. He was aware that this was a significant thing. The Caliber 89 auction catalog was a document that collectors read and kept and referenced. An expert evaluation credit in that document was the kind of thing that had a long half-life. You don't have to do that, he said. I know, she said, and left. The auction ran past 11. Theodore stayed for it, sitting at a table near the back where Harold Fenwick had found him a seat and where a very pleasant woman named, he would not remember exactly, something beginning with D, who worked in municipal planning, asked him polite questions about watchmaking that he tried to answer without boring her. The Caliber 89 went to an anonymous bidder on the phone for just under $400,000. The room applauded. The evening moved on. He found his coat at the coat check and was waiting for the elevator when the doors opened and Sylvia Ashford stepped out, phone in hand, mid-sentence with someone who was clearly her assistant. She stopped when she saw him. She ended the call. Heading out? She said. Early start tomorrow, he said. Someone's bringing in an Omega constellation with a broken stem. She almost smiled again. He was beginning to recognize the particular pre-smile, the fraction of a second before it appeared and then didn't quite. Those are straightforward, she said. Usually, he said. Except when they're not. The elevator arrived. He held the door. She didn't take it. She had somewhere else to be, or she was still deciding, or both. The catalog credit will be finalized Monday, she said. If you want to review the language before it's printed, I can have my assistant send it over. That would be fine, he said. He got into the elevator. She stood in the lobby with her phone in her hand, and as the doors closed, he caught a last glimpse of her expression, which was thoughtful in a way that had nothing to do with the catalog. He drove home through the October dark. The streets of Ottawa at midnight were almost empty, and the radio played something low and instrumental, and he thought about the watch, about the tourbillon running slightly fast, about the dried oil in the keyless works, about 570 parts all doing what they were built to do, each one essential, none of them visible unless you knew where to look. He pulled into the driveway at 12:15. The house was dark except for the kitchen light, which he'd left on, and the faint glow from the second-floor hallway that told him the grandmother had left the nightlight on for Poppy. He unlocked the door quietly, took off his shoes, hung the coat, stood in the kitchen for a moment in the silence that a house makes when everyone in it is asleep. On the table, in Poppy's handwriting, careful and large and slightly crooked because she was still learning to keep her letters on the line, there was a note. It said, "Did you see a fancy clock? Did it work? I love you, Daddy. I am asleep." He read it twice. He set it carefully on the counter where he would see it in the morning. He turned off the kitchen light. He was almost at the stairs when his phone vibrated once. A message. He looked at it in the dark. It was from a number he didn't recognize. It said, "The coffee offer has no expiry. S.A." He looked at it for a long time. He put the phone in his pocket. He climbed the stairs. He looked in on Poppy, who was deeply asleep with her arm around a stuffed rabbit she had owned since she was 2 and still refused to admit she needed. The flashlight was on the bedside table. He turned it off. He stood in the doorway of his daughter's room for a moment in the small and ordinary dark, and then he went to bed, thinking that some things, like very fine movements, needed no adjustment at all, only the right kind of attention and enough time.